The gate at Ray Jordan's ranch had been frozen shut for 11 days. Not stuck, not stiff the way a gate gets in a cold snap you can push through with your shoulder. Frozen solid, the latch encased in a finger of ice an inch thick, the hinges locked in place by successive nights that had dropped to -20, -27, and on the worst night of that January, -38 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that splits fence posts along grain lines you didn't know were there. The kind that kills a calf in 4 hours if it can't get under its mother. On the morning of February 3rd, 2019, a truck Ray didn't recognize came up the county road and idled at that gate. Then he did recognize it. It was Denny Birch's diesel, a green crew cab with a cracked passenger mirror and a bumper sticker from a seed company that hadn't made that particular sticker since 2015. Ray was already in the barn. He had been up since 4:30, moving hay, checking on a cow that had gone off her feed 2 days earlier. Through a gap in the barn wall where the siding had warped, he could see the truck sitting at the gate. He watched Denny climb out, work the latch with his gloved hands, fail, and then stand there in the road looking at the house. Ray set down the hay hook and walked out. Denny Birch was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who took up space in a room the way a wood stove does, and for most of his adult life that presence had served him well. He ran the Birch family feed and supply on the south end of Kearney Creek Road alongside his brother, and for 20 years he had been the man ranchers in that county called first when they needed to know whether a price was fair or a forecast was worth believing. He knew his business. He was good with numbers and better with people, and he had never, to Ray's knowledge, been wrong about anything important enough to remember. He was wrong about this winter. Ray walked to the gate and knocked the ice out of the latch with the heel of his hand. It took 3 hits. The gate swung open. Denny looked at him, and then looked at the barn. "Ray," he said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. "Come in," Ray said. That was February, 2019. Let me back up to where this started, because the story of that winter begins in a feed store in October 2018. And before that, it begins at a kitchen table in 2002. And before that, it begins with a man who watched the sky for 40 years and wrote down everything he saw. Ray had driven into the Birch store on a Thursday in October, the second week of the month, when the cottonwoods along the creek had already dropped most of their leaves 3 weeks ahead of schedule. He'd noted that in the journal that morning, the same way he noted it every year, comparing it to the record his father had kept. He pulled around back to the loading bay and told the man at the dock he needed 340 round bales. The dock man went inside. A minute later, Denny came out with his clipboard, reading the order form over his bifocals. 340, Denny said, not as a question exactly, more like a man reading a misprint. 340, Ray said. Denny looked up. Ray, the Weather Service, put out their seasonal outlook last week. Mild and dry through February. You see that? I saw it. Most of the ranchers I've talked to are coming in at 160, 180 bales. Carl Pitts was in here Tuesday, took 180, said he's going to bank the savings toward his calving operation. Ray said he'd take 340. Denny wrote it down, but he wasn't finished. He had 2 other men standing nearby, a rancher named Walt Gregg, who ran a small operation up on the ridge, and the dock hand who'd gone to get Denny in the first place. Denny looked at both of them, and then back at Ray. That's going to run you about $23,000, he said. You know that? $68 a bale. I know. For a 210-head herd through a mild winter, Ray. That's roughly twice what you need. He wasn't being mean. Denny was rarely mean. He was explaining the way a man explains arithmetic to someone he's decided needs the help. You got a good herd. Don't let it sit in hay you're not going to burn. Ray thanked him and said he'd take 340 bales. Walt Gregg told that story at the co-op the following Saturday. He told it as a kind of fond joke, the way you talk about a man who does things his own way past the point where it makes sense. He said Ray Jordan had just spent $23,000 on hay for a weather forecast that said mild and dry. Denny, who was there at the co-op that morning, added that he'd tried to talk him out of it. Told him he was buying twice what he needed, Denny said, over coffee with 4 other ranchers at the folding table near the front. Man's going to have a barn full of hay in March, and not a bit of it needed. He shook his head, and there was laughter, not cruel laughter, just the easy, comfortable laughter of men who were confident they understood arithmetic better than the man they were discussing. That was the second time the dismissal landed in a public place with the witnesses. The third time came in early November at a county extension meeting in the community room of the Kearney Creek Fire Station. Wade Ennis was running the meeting. Wade was the county extension agent, a careful man who cited his sources and updated his thinking every time the state office sent new data. He had put the Weather Service seasonal outlook on a foam board at the front of the room and was walking through the implications for winter feeding. He recommended that ranchers who had planned heavy hay reserves consider pulling back, that the mild forecast was reliable based on the El Nino pattern in the Pacific, and that the savings could be applied to equipment maintenance or calving supplies. He said this clearly and without arrogance, because Wade wasn't arrogant. He was just a man who trusted the institutions that were built to be trusted. Ray was in the back row. Someone asked Wade what he thought about ranchers who had already bought heavy. Wade said he thought they were being prudent in their own way, but that based on the current data, he wouldn't have made that call himself. He glanced toward the back of the room. He didn't name Ray. He didn't need to. Ray drove home that night on roads that were still clear, past Carl Pitts's place where the lights were on in the kitchen, and a new loader tractor sat beside the barn, payments presumably running every month on a note from the ag lender in town. He drove his own truck, a 2001 Dodge with 280,000 miles on it, a crack in the defroster grid on the passenger side that he'd been meaning to fix since spring, and a set of tires that were on their third winter, but had plenty of tread left. He'd paid the truck off in 2006. He went to the kitchen table when he got home. His daughter Lena was at the other end of it with her laptop, doing the bookkeeping she'd taken over the previous year. She was 26, patient with numbers the way her grandfather had been, and she had her doubts about the hay purchase in the same way a sensible person has doubts about any large commitment made against the grain of expert advice. Wade say anything useful? She asked. Recommended lighter reserves. She was quiet for a moment. We're committed. We are. She looked at him. You're not worried? Not particularly. She had seen the journal by then, had seen it since she was a girl, but she had never sat down and read through it the way you'd read something you were meant to learn from. There was a longer version of the conversation between them that night, the kind of conversation that did not happen often between Ray and Lena because neither of them had much use for talking past the point. She closed the laptop and looked at him for a moment. I want to ask you a thing, and I want you to answer it, like you would answer Wade Ennis, she said. He waited. If the Weather Service is wrong, what does it cost us to be wrong with them? If they're wrong and we're right, what's the difference? Ray thought about it. He took a sip of coffee. He said, "If they're wrong and we go light, we lose cattle. Maybe a lot. The cost is in the herd and in the years it takes to rebuild it. If we go heavy and they're right, we have a barn full of hay in March that the cattle don't need. We feed it out next winter. The cost is the carrying cost on the bales for 1 year, $23,000 at maybe 6% of capital tied up. That's about $1,400 in opportunity cost. And we get the bales back as feed inventory." She did the math in her head. $1,400 against losing a third of the herd. Roughly. And the chance the forecast is wrong. I'd put it on 1 in 3 for a winter that comes off this fall pattern, higher than the Weather Service would put it. On what data? 46 years between Roy's notebook and mine. 16 mild forecasts that came off a cottonwood and fence line fall like this one. 11 of those 16 turned hard. 4 of them turned what I'd call brutal. She wrote that on a sheet of paper. 16, 11, 4. He nodded. She looked at the paper for a long minute. Then she said, "Okay." She did not say more than that. She got up and put the kettle on for a second cup of coffee, and she came back to the table and opened the laptop and went back to the bookkeeping. The conversation was not an argument. It was an audit. It was a composition book her grandfather, Roy Jordan, had started in 1962, filled in through the spring of 2002, the year he died. 40 years of weather entries, written in pencil in the cramped, left-leaning script of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and never saw a reason to change. Each entry had the date, the temperature morning and noon, the wind direction and force, the cloud type if clouds were present, the precipitation, and a note about what the animals were doing. Cattle behavior, whether the horses were restless, whether the dogs had moved their sleeping spots. Roy Jordan had also written down every public forecast he encountered, from the radio, from the extension office, from the seed company calendars. And next to each forecast he had written what actually happened in the same plain pencil without comment. Ray had inherited it in the fall of 2002, after the funeral, after the lawyers were done with the simpler parts of the estate. The journal was in a shoebox with Roy's pocket knife and a book of matches from a diner that had closed in 1978. Ray had sat at the same kitchen table and read every page of it in one sitting that October night, and when he was done, he had started a new composition book and continued the record himself. By the fall of 2018, he had 16 years of his own entries alongside his father's 40. He had watched the pattern his father had noticed, which was this. In years when the cottonwoods on the creek dropped early and the cattle began pressing toward the windbreak fence in September, the winter that followed was reliably harder than whatever the official forecast said. Not always the coldest winter, not always the snowiest, but longer and more grinding and harder on hay reserves than the mild and dry forecast categories prepared you for. Roy had noted this in a margin entry sometime in the 1970s, in slightly larger letters than his usual hand, as if he wanted to make sure someone else would find it. When the trees let go early and the cattle moved to the fence in September, bye for a hard winter, no matter what the radio says. Ray had underlined that entry in ballpoint pen sometime around 2007, after a winter when he had taken his father's advice against a mild forecast and come out in March with 30 bales to spare and a herd with no losses. He had underlined it again in the fall of 2011. He did not underline it again in 2018 because he no longer needed to. Carl Pitts was a decent rancher. This needs saying. He ran a clean operation, kept his fences tight, weaned his calves on time, and had a reasonable sense of when to push his animals and when to let them rest. He was not careless, and he was not foolish. He had taken the Weather Service forecast and the extension agent's recommendation because those were the rational inputs available to him, and he had made a sound decision based on those inputs. He had saved himself roughly $7,000 in hay costs by ordering 180 bales instead of 340. He put that money toward the payments on the loader tractor, which was a reasonable thing to do. The cold came in on December 9th. Not a cold snap, a cold system, the kind that comes down from the Alberta plains with moisture packed behind it and settles in over the high country and does not move for weeks. The Weather Service caught it about 72 hours out and began revising. By December 12th, their revised outlook had dropped the projected temperatures by 18 to 22 degrees from the seasonal forecast. By December 15th, with temperatures sitting at -14 at midday and forecast to drop further, the revision notices from the Extension Office went out. But Wade Ennis later said, carefully and without making excuses, that by the time the revision reached ranchers who had already reduced their hay orders, it was too late in the season to source replacement bales at any price that made sense, and in some cases impossible to find bales at all. Carl made some calls. He found bales at a place 2 counties east, but the price had moved to $91, and the trucker he'd used to haul them wanted $400 for the run. He ordered 40 bales, stretching his budget, and told his wife Helen that if the cold broke by mid-January, they'd be fine. The cold did not break by mid-January. Ray's days during December and January ran on a fixed clock, up at 4:30, into the barn by 5, feed the 210 head their morning ration, working from the front of the hay storage toward the back, using a round bale unroller he'd built himself from a salvaged tractor axle and some angle iron. The baler had cost him $60 in parts and a Saturday afternoon in 1997. It still worked. He checked each animal as he moved through, looking at their eyes, their ribs, their gait. The cow who had gone off her feed came back around the 3rd week of December after he added a mineral supplement and moved her away from a dominant heifer who had been crowding her at the feeder. He lost no weight on her. He lost no weight on any of them. The morning of December 22nd was a useful sample. The thermometer on the porch post read -22 when Ray came out the back door at 10 minutes to 5. The wind was out of the northwest at 16 miles per hour, which on the wind chill calculation meant the cattle would feel something close to -48. He had already laid out his clothing the night before in the order it would go on. Insulated coveralls over wool long johns over a cotton union suit, 2 pairs of socks, the felt-pack boots he had owned since 2011, with new liners he had bought through a catalog the previous September, leather choppers over wool glove liners, a wool watch cap under the hood of the coveralls. He had a thermos of coffee in his left coverall pocket and a pair of fencing pliers in his right, because at temperatures below -20-something always needed a small repair. He started the 1979 John Deere 4040 in the implement shed at 503. The 4040 had a block heater. Ray had installed in 1991, plugged into an extension cord that ran from a yard outlet, and the engine caught on the second crank. He let it warm at low idle for 8 minutes while he opened the barn doors and pulled the unroller into position behind the tractor. The first bale of the morning was a third-cut alfalfa and grass mix from a hay producer in Sheridan County that Ray had been buying from for 7 years. He chose it for the December run because the protein was higher than the early-cut bales and the cattle needed the calories at depth of winter. The unroller laid the bale out in a long, even line along the north windbreak. which was the best feeding position on the windiest mornings because the cattle could eat with the wind at their tails. He counted heads as they came in. 210. The big black baldy cow he called number 41 was at the head of the line, as she always was. The young heifer he called 11 was at the back, as she usually was. He lifted his thermos and took a sip of coffee while he watched them eat. Lena was there most days by 6, having driven out from the house she rented in town, 15 miles on roads that were passable until they were not. That morning she came in at 6:14, the headlights of her Chevy cutting across the south fence. She had a knit cap pulled low and a wool coat over her own coveralls, and she nodded at him the way she nodded every morning. No words, just acknowledgement. She kept the water tanks from freezing using electric tank heaters Ray had installed in 2009 and serviced every October. And she moved hay alongside her father in silence that was not uncomfortable. That morning she pulled the small breaker on the south tank, where the heater element had burned out the day before, replaced the element from the spare she kept in the truck, restarted it, and held her bare hand over the surface for a minute to make sure the temperature was rising. She used a pocket thermometer to confirm. 41 degrees in the tank water. She wrote it on the index card she kept in her shirt pocket, which was the same kind of card her father carried, which was the same kind of card her grandfather had carried before either of them. She had stopped asking questions about the journal. She had started watching the herd the way her father watched the herd. At 7:20, Ray crossed paths with her near the gate to the south pasture. They stood for a minute and watched the cattle finish the line. The wind had not let up. The sky had the high, thin overcast of a system that was going to get worse before it got better, and Ray said so, and Lena said she had heard the same on the radio in the truck. Then they each went back to what they had been doing. On January 8th, the roads closed. Officially, the County Highway Department posted the closure at 6 in the morning, citing drifting and ice. Unofficially, the road that connected Ray's ranch to the county road had been impassable since January 5th, when a drift built overnight against the east fence and effectively sealed the approach. Ray had been prepped for this possibility. He had driven to town on January 4th, filling the truck with diesel and propane and a case of canned goods Lena had suggested. He had not panicked. He had driven to town calmly on roads that were still barely open, and he had come home and put everything away in the order it would be needed. Those roads stayed closed for 11 consecutive days. Carl Pitts ran out of hay on January 14th. He had 195 head of cattle. He had started with 180 bales, plus the 40 he had sourced at the higher price, so 220 bales total. At the rate he was burning through them in the cold, his herd needed roughly 35 pounds of hay per head per day, meaning he was moving through close to 7,000 pounds of hay every morning. A round bale at 1,200 pounds, his math had assumed he could stretch the daily ration, push the cattle toward a bit of sacrifice, and come out ahead. He pushed them. By January 12th, they were already losing condition. By January 14th, the last bale was gone. He called 3 neighbors that morning. 2 of them had nothing to sell. The third had 20 bales he could spare, but wanted $120 a bale at this point in the winter, which Carl could not argue with, and Carl did not have the cash on hand. He called the ag lender in town and left a message. He called his brother in Casper, who had no cattle and no hay. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at his herd pressing against the windbreak fence, and he said something to Helen that she would not repeat afterward, not the words of it, just that he had said it. 47 of Carl's cattle died between January 14th and January 22nd. Some of them went down from hypothermia alone, their core temperatures dropping in the sustained cold, without the heat of digestion to maintain them. Some of them starved outright. Carl got 12 of the youngest ones into the barn and kept them on a trickle of grain, and they survived. The rest did not. Let me tell you about Denny Birch's small herd, because Denny had 16 cattle of his own on a 10-acre parcel behind the feed store, a hobby operation that he'd started in 2012 when his kids were young enough to think it was interesting. He had ordered hay for them the same way he ordered everything, lean and practical, and by the third week of January he had 4 days of feed left and a road that was not open. He called Walt Gregg, who had nothing extra. He called 2 other men he knew. He sat in his truck in front of the feed store on January 22nd and thought about who might have hay. He drove to Ray's gate. Ray walked out and knocked the ice from the latch with the heel of his hand and swung the gate open. They stood there for a moment in the wind, 2 men who had known each other for 25 years, and Denny said, "I've got 16 head and about 4 days of feed." "How much do you need?" Denny told him. Ray walked him to the barn. He still had 112 bales. Let that number sit for a moment. 112 round bales on February 3rd, when the winter he had prepped for was mostly spent. He had burned through 228 bales between October and February, keeping 210 head fed and healthy through 11 days of closed roads and temperatures that had not climbed above zero for 19 consecutive nights. He had not lost a single animal. He sold Denny 20 bales at $68 a bale, exactly what he'd paid for them, not $1 more. He did not say anything about the co-op that October Saturday, and he did not say anything about the extension meeting in November, and he did not say anything about the 340 bales that everyone in the county had found funny 4 months earlier. He wrote Denny a receipt on a notepad he kept on a nail by the barn door, and he helped him load. Denny stood by the tailgate while Ray hooked the last bale strap. He said, "I owe you more than the price." Ray said, "You don't. Pay me what's on the receipt." Denny reached into his coat and brought out a check already made out, signed for the right amount. He'd done the math in the truck. He handed it over and stood there looking at the barn, at the remaining bales visible through the open door. He said, "Ray, I should have asked you in October what you knew." Ray took the check and folded it and put it in his chest pocket. "You can ask now," he said, "if you want." Denny did ask. Not right then, not standing in the cold, but in March when the roads were clear and the worst of the winter had passed. He drove out again and sat at Ray's kitchen table. Ray put coffee on and got out the journal, the older one, his father's, and set it on the table between them. "My father started that in 1962, Ray said. "Kept it until he died." Denny picked it up with both hands. He turned pages slowly, reading Roy's cramped entries, the dates and temperatures, the wind notes, the animal behaviors, the forecasts alongside the outcomes. He read the margin note, the one about the cottonwoods and the fence line in September. He read Ray's 2 underlines. He read quietly for about 10 minutes, and then he set it down. 40 years, he said. "And 16 more of mine," Ray said. Denny did not say he was sorry. He was not the kind of man who made speeches, but he said something that Ray noted in his own journal later. In his version of the same plain hand, on a March page under the temperature reading and the wind direction, Denny said he had trusted numbers without understanding where the numbers came from. Said he'd think different about that from now on. Ray wrote it down the way his father had written down everything as an observed fact, without judgment attached. That spring brought other things to settle. Carl Pitts had come through the winter with 148 head of cattle, where he'd started with 195. He had vet bills from the animals who had needed care in the aftermath of the hard weeks, the ones who survived but had come close, and those bills had run to $11,000. He had the note on the loader tractor, which he could carry. He had the operating line from the ag lender, which was straining. He had 160 acres of east pasture that had been in his family since his grandfather broke it in the 1940s, and in April he told Helen he was going to have to sell it. The market price on that kind of ground, open pasture in that county, was running around $1,400 an acre that spring. 160 acres at full market would have brought Carl $224,000. He did not have the time to wait for a full market buyer. He needed the money before summer. And the people who buy land at full market price need time, need surveys and financing and decisions made slowly. He found a buyer willing to close in 30 days at $10.50 an acre. It was a 75-cent loss on every dollar, and Carl knew it, and he had no other choice that he could see. He listed it quietly, meaning he told a few people he trusted, and Ray heard about it through the county extension office, where Wade Ennis had mentioned it in passing while updating his records. Ray called Carl from the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in April. He asked if Carl was still looking for a buyer on the east pasture. Carl said he was. Ray said he'd be willing to buy 80 of those acres at the price Carl had been offered. He said he didn't need the full 160, and he didn't want Carl to feel pressured into selling more than he had to. Carl was quiet for a moment. "You're buying at $10.50? 80 acres, $10.50 an acre," Ray said. "That's $84,000. I'll pay cash. I can close in 2 weeks." The silence on Carl's end was the kind of silence that comes when a man is trying to keep his voice steady. "Ray, the market's 1,400. "I know what the market is," Ray said. "The price is $10.50, because that's what you were offered, and I'm not going to take advantage of a man's season to make myself a better deal. $10.50 is fair for what you need to do right now. Take a day and think about it." Carl called back the next morning. He sold Ray the 80 acres. The remaining 80 acres Carl sold to a third party at $10.50 as well, because the same buyer who had originally offered him the package price was still interested, and Carl needed it finished. He cleared $168,000 on the total sale, enough to cover the vet bills, pay down the operating line, and make 6 months of tractor payments in advance. He came out of that spring in worse shape than he'd entered the previous fall, but not ruined and not in foreclosure, which was the outcome that had been possible for about 3 weeks in February, when the cattle were dying and the roads were closed. Ray called him again in May. He said he had 80 acres of east pasture he wasn't going to use for anything for at least a year, and he was thinking about whether Carl might want to run some cattle on 40 of those acres on a grazing lease. He said the price would be $12 an acre per month when they got to charging for it, which would not be this season. This season would be free. Carl said, "Ray, why would you do that?" Ray said, "Because it's good ground and it ought to be used, and your cattle know that ground better than mine would." The summer that followed was, by the measure of the people who lived through it, a quiet one. Carl rebuilt his herd slowly, culling carefully, leaning on the 40 leased acres through July and August. Denny Birch sold the last of his 16 cattle in the fall of 2019 and did not replace them. And when people asked him about it, he said he had a lot of respect for people who did that work right and had decided he wasn't one of them. Wade Ennis wrote up the winter's outcomes in a county extension circular that fall, including the documented cattle losses across the area and the hay reserve data he'd collected in the aftermath. He wrote one paragraph about ranchers who had maintained heavy reserves against the official forecast, and came through with no animal losses. And though he did not name Ray in that paragraph, anyone in the county who read it knew who he was describing. Wade drove out to the ranch in September of that year, on a clear afternoon when the cottonwoods along the creek were already beginning to drop their leaves, 3 weeks ahead of what the calendar said they should. He sat at the kitchen table where Denny had sat, and where Carl had sat the spring before, and Ray got out both journals, his father's and his own, and walked Wade through the pattern, the early leaf drop, the September fence pressing, the 40-year record of hard winters following those signs against forecasts that said otherwise. Wade asked careful questions and wrote things down in a spiral notebook. He asked whether Ray would object to having the method described in the circular, without his name if Ray preferred. Ray said he didn't mind either way. Wade put his name in. It was 2 years after that, in the fall of 2021, that Lena Jordan formally took over the day-to-day management of the ranch. This was not a dramatic event. There was no ceremony. Ray was 58 and healthy and perfectly capable of running a 450-acre operation, but he had spent the previous 2 years watching Lena watch the cattle, watching her walk the pasture lines in the evenings the way his father had walked them, watching her keep her own notes in a small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She was ready. He had been watching for when she would be ready since she was about 12 years old, and he was certain now. He asked her to sit down at the table one evening in October, which was not unusual because they sat at that table most evenings. He put both journals in front of her, his father's and his own. He opened his father's to the margin note, the one about the cottonwoods and the September fence line, the one with 2 ballpoint underlines on top of the original pencil. "Read this," he said. She read it. She already knew it, had read it as a child and again after the winter of 2018. But she read it again now the way you read something when the person who is handing it to you is handing it over for keeps. She looked up. "How do I keep this going?" "Same way he did," Ray said. "Same way I did. Write down what you see. Write down what the forecast says. Come back later and write down what happened. After enough years, you'll know more than the forecast knows." She asked him something he hadn't expected. She asked why his father had started the journal in the first place in 1962, what had made Roy Jordan decide to keep a 40-year record of weather and animal behavior when no one had asked him to and no institution would ever validate it. Ray thought about it. He said, "I think he lost some cattle in a hard winter he hadn't prepared for. I think he decided he wasn't going to trust someone else's numbers over his own eyes again." Lena nodded. She closed the journal and held it for a moment. Then she opened her own small notebook to the last entry she had made and set it down beside the 2 composition books, 3 notebooks in a row on the kitchen table, 1962 through 2021, 60 years of watching. Ray poured 2 cups of coffee and sat back down. Outside, the first hard cold of the season was settling in over the high country. The kind that comes in under a clear sky and has no drama to announce itself. The temperature on the thermometer mounted to the porch post was already at 9 degrees and falling, and it was only the 6th of October. The cottonwoods on the creek had started dropping their leaves on the 14th of September. He had already made his calls. The ranch had 340 bales in the barn.